The corner of Riverside Cafe smelled like burnt sugar and regret, though Garrett Lawson wouldn't have used either of those words to describe it. He would have said it smelled like Saturday, which was its own category of thing, the particular combination of dark roast and radiator heat, and the low murmur of strangers who had nowhere urgent to be. He came here every week, not because the coffee was exceptional, which it wasn't, but because the corner table by the window had a wobble that nobody else wanted, and that wobble had become, over the past 2 years, the closest thing he had to a ritual. He set his mug down on the high side of the table and opened the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. The notebook was nothing special. Spiral-bound college ruled, the kind that came in a 3-pack from the drugstore. He had filled 4 of them in the past 3 years, not with lesson plans or grocery lists, or the kind of things a person might expect a 34-year-old high school history teacher to be writing down on a Saturday morning. He filled them with things his daughter said. Bryn had said something worth keeping just 11 minutes ago on the walk from their car to the cafe door. She had been watching a pigeon navigate around a crack in the sidewalk, stepping over it with elaborate, unnecessary caution, and she had looked up and announced with the authority of someone who had given the matter serious thought, "Daddy, I think that pigeon has been through something." Garrett had written it down before the door closed behind them, 3 words tucked in next to the date, and Bryn had watched him do it with the satisfied expression of a person who understood their words were being taken seriously. She was 6. She had understood this since she was 4. Now she sat across from him with her glass of water, the ice already melting into the pale, diluted nothing that passed for her Saturday morning drink, and she was describing in extraordinary detail the geopolitical situation of her classroom, which apparently involved a disputed territory near the supply closet, and a classmate named Theo, who had, according to Bryn, the diplomatic instincts of a ceiling fan. Garrett listened with the quality of attention that had become second nature to him. Full unhurried, the kind that cost something to sustain, but that he had decided 2 years ago in a different and harder season of his life was the one thing he would not let himself shortchange. And then Bryn said, planting both elbows on the table with a thunk, he took the good scissors. Not the backup scissors, the good ones with the orange handles. "That's a serious escalation. It's a crisis, Daddy. It's basically a crisis." He almost smiled into his coffee, almost because the barista chose that moment to approach their table for the second time that morning, a young woman with a practical ponytail who had apparently not yet connected the dots between the man who ordered a single medium black coffee at 9:03 and the fact that it was now 9:57 and the cup had been refilled exactly once. "Can I get you anything else?" She directed the question at the general middle distance between them, the way people did when they were trying to be neutral about the single item on the table. "Just the 2 of you this morning?" "Yes." The word came out a half-beat too fast with the particular flatness of a response that had been given so many times it no longer required a breath first. Garrett looked down at his mug. The coffee had gone to that temperature that was no longer hot, but hadn't yet become cold, the exact temperature of something you keep holding because putting it down would mean deciding something. Bryn did not appear to notice. She had moved on to a detailed recounting of the orange-handled scissors incident, gesturing with both hands, and Garrett let her voice settle back around him like something familiar and necessary. He had been doing this the Saturday morning cafe, the notebook, the 1 cup of coffee stretched across 90 minutes since Bryn was 4, and the apartment they'd moved into after the divorce had walls thin enough to hear the neighbor's television, and Bryn had started waking up on Saturday mornings saying she wanted to go somewhere. Not anywhere specific, just somewhere. So they'd found Riverside 2 weeks into the new life, and they'd claimed the wobbling corner table, and they'd made it theirs in the way that people make things theirs when they don't have much else to make. He was not unhappy. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself, on mornings like this one, when the light came through the window at the angle that made Portland look like it was trying. He was not unhappy. He was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name. Something like a house where all the rooms were being used, but one door stayed closed because opening it required more certainty than he currently possessed. He wrote down what Bryn said about the scissors. Then he capped the pen and watched his daughter talk. She was mid-sentence when the bell above the cafe door rang. He didn't look up immediately. The doorbell rang on average once every 4 minutes during the Saturday rush, and he had long since trained himself not to track it. But something in the quality of the silence that followed a small, irregular pocket of it amid the cafe noise made him glance toward the entrance. The woman standing just inside the door was using forearm crutches, the kind with the metal cuffs that wrapped around the arm, and she was holding herself very still in the way that people hold themselves still when they are assessing something quickly and do not want anyone to notice the assessment. She was maybe 23, probably younger than she looked right now, with light hair pulled back into a ponytail that had been neat at some earlier point in the morning and was now losing that argument. She wore jeans and a canvas jacket over a gray sweater, and she carried a canvas tote bag on one shoulder that was slightly too heavy for the angle she was holding it at, the weight of it pulling her left side down in a way she kept correcting without appearing to think about it. Her eyes moved across the cafe with a kind of desperate efficiency. Not the ordinary scanning of a person looking for an open seat, something more pressurized, more urgent, like the scanning of a person who had used up most of what they had just getting here and needed the next thing to work. It didn't work. Garrett watched her approach the first table, a couple near the door, both of them with matching ceramic mugs and matching expressions of pleasant self-containment. The woman said something he couldn't hear. The man shook his head. Not rudely, just finely. The way you shake your head when you mean it. She moved to the next table. Bryn had paused her narration to watch the scissors crisis temporarily suspended. The woman with the crutches asked at 3 more tables. Each time the answer was the same variant of no polite brief, the specific apologetic tone people use when they're saying no to something they could theoretically say yes to. Garrett tracked the small erosion happening in her posture with each refusal, the way she kept rebuilding it before she took the next step. The way that kind of rebuilding costs more each time you have to do it. Then her eyes found his table. For a moment she just stood where she was, maybe 10 feet away, and looked at him with an expression he would think about later and still not be able to fully name. It was something between exhaustion and a very specific kind of courage, the kind that is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move anyway, because the alternative is standing still in the middle of a cafe holding a canvas tote bag that is too heavy until someone makes you leave. She came toward them. Bryn went completely quiet, which was not something that happened often or easily. Up close, the woman's eyes were a pale gray that had been cried into. Recently, the particular red-rimmed quality of eyes that had been working harder than eyes should have to work. She steadied her crutches and looked at Garrett with an expression that was trying to be apologetic and neutral at once, and not fully succeeding at either. "I'm sorry to bother you." Her voice was low-controlled in the way of someone who was controlling it deliberately. "I know you're busy. Is there any chance I could share this table, just for a little while?" She swallowed. "I really need to be here today." Garrett looked at her. Actually looked, not the brief social assessment people perform to confirm someone exists, but the kind of looking that takes in the weight of the bag and the tension in her jaw and the word today, and understands that today is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. "Yeah," he said before anything else had time to organize itself in his mind. "Of course. Sit down." The relief that moved through her was so visible it seemed physical, like watching someone set down something they'd been carrying for a very long distance. "Thank you. Thank you so much." She maneuvered herself into the chair across from Bryn, leaning the crutches against the wall with the practiced ease of someone who had learned the geometry of this particular movement, and she set the canvas tote on the floor beside her feet. Bryn, who had been uncharacteristically still for approximately 45 seconds, which was her personal record in Garrett's experience, now re-engaged at full capacity. "I'm Bryn. That's my dad, Garrett. He's a history teacher, but he's not boring, even though most people think teachers are boring, which is a stereotype. Do you know what a stereotype is? We learned about them. Why do you have crutches? Did something happen to your leg? My friend Oliver broke his collarbone last year, and he had to wear a sling, and everyone drew on it with markers, and he said it was his favorite month of his life, which seems like an overreaction, but also I kind of understand it." The woman blinked. Something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lives right next to a smile. The thing that happens to a face before it remembers it's allowed to. "I'm Nora," she said. "Nora Castellan." Nora. Bryn tested the word with the precision of someone running a quality check. That's a good name. It sounds like a name from an old book. Maybe. The almost smile again. It was my grandmother's name. I'm named after a bird, Bryn said. They're small birds. They're loud for how small they are, which Daddy says suits me. She paused. Does your leg hurt, Bryn? Garrett's voice was mild. It's a real question. It's okay. Nora looked at Bryn, directly treating the question as it deserved to be treated. Sometimes. Not right now. Bryn appeared to accept this as a complete answer and pivoted immediately. Are you meeting someone here? Nora's hands were on the edge of the table and something happened in them, a small tightening quickly released. No. So you're alone. Bryn, why don't you go grab some napkins from the counter? We have napkins. Extra napkins. Bryn looked at the napkins on the table, then at her father, then at Nora, performing a rapid triangulation of the social situation. Okay, she said in the tone of someone who is agreeing but reserving judgment, and slid out of her chair. The moment she was at the counter, Garrett leaned forward slightly. You don't have to answer anything she asks. She operates without a filter. It's not personal. It's just she's 6. She's wonderful. Nora's voice had gone quiet in a different way than before. She reminds me of someone. Good someone. Nora looked down at her hands. My little sister. The silence that came after that was not empty. It had texture and weight and a specific kind of temperature, and Garrett sat in it without trying to fill it, which was something he had learned to do in the past 2 years and which still sometimes required active effort. I'm sorry, he said. Nora shook her head slightly, not in disagreement but in the way people shake their heads when an apology is both insufficient and the best available thing. I'm not ready to talk about it yet. She looked up at him, and there was something very direct in her eyes, something that had stopped apologizing for itself. Is it okay if I just sit here for a while? I won't be strange about it. I just needed not to be alone today. Garrett thought about a lot of things in the space of the next 3 seconds, none of which he said out loud. Instead, stay as long as you need. Bryn returned with a quantity of napkins that suggested she had taken the assignment seriously and deposited them on the table with the satisfied air of a mission accomplished, and then immediately resumed the conversation as though the pause had not occurred. Within 4 minutes she had established that Nora was 23, that she liked strong coffee, that she had once owned a cat named Tommy who had very specific opinions about which blankets he would tolerate, and that today was her birthday. Today. Bryn sat up so fast the table wobbled. Today is your birthday. Nora's chin dipped slightly. Yeah. Bryn turned to look at Garrett with the expression she got when a situation had revealed itself to be more serious than initially assessed. Her eyes were very round and very brown and completely serious. Daddy, it's her birthday and she's here alone. Bryn, no. Bryn slid out of her chair and stood up on it, which she had been told not to do, and cupped her hands around her mouth, which Garrett had about 1 second to anticipate before it became irreversible. Excuse me, everyone. Her voice, which was large for a person her size under normal circumstances, filled the café without apparent effort. It's this lady's birthday today and she's here by herself. The café went very quiet. Every face turned toward their corner table. Nora's color rose in a way that suggested she was considering whether the floor might open for her if she asked politely enough. Bryn did not wait for a verdict from the room. She began to sing. She did not have a technically proficient singing voice. What she had was volume-complete fearlessness, and the particular conviction of a person who has decided that the thing they are doing is correct and has therefore stopped worrying about how it looks. The first line of Happy Birthday went out into the café like a small and unstoppable thing, and for 3 full seconds nothing happened. And then a woman at the table by the window joined in. Then the 2 men behind the counter. Then the couple near the door who had told Nora no singing now without apparent irony or discomfort. Within 30 seconds, everyone in Riverside Café was singing. Garrett found himself singing too, his voice low and a half-step rough the way it always was when he sang, which was almost never watching Nora's face as the sound of it surrounded her. He watched the moment when she stopped bracing for something and started feeling something instead. The tears came without drama. No shaking, no covering her face. Just the quiet overflow of a person who had been holding too much for too long and had been ambushed by kindness in the specific way that kindness sometimes does ambush people coming from a direction they weren't defending. The cafe applauded. Bryn took a bow. It was a full bow hand at the waist, completely committed. Nora was laughing and crying at the same time, her hands pressed over her mouth, and Garrett thought that the particular expression of a person laughing while they cry was one of the most human things a face could do. The way it contained two opposite conditions simultaneously without either one canceling the other out. Bryn climbed down from her chair and crossed around the table and wrapped both arms around Nora's neck with the complete physical confidence of a child who has not yet learned to ask permission before giving comfort. "Birthdays matter," she said directly into Nora's ear, "even when it doesn't feel like they do." Garrett stood up. He walked to the counter and took his wallet from his back pocket and counted the bills inside. $12. He thought about the pizza Bryn had asked about on the drive over. The way her voice had been carefully calibrated not to sound like she was really asking. He thought about the fact that his next paycheck was Monday, and that $12 needed to get them through 48 hours. He thought about Nora's face when the whole cafe sang to her, the way it looked like a person remembering they were visible. "Do you still have that cinnamon roll?" he asked the barista. "The corner piece, the one with the extra icing. Last one. Can I get a candle in it?" The barista didn't ask him to explain. She just went and got it. 5 minutes later, he set the plate on the table. The cinnamon roll was large and aggressively frosted and had a single birthday candle stuck in the center at a slight angle. Nora looked at it the way people look at things that are simultaneously small and enormous. "Make a wish," Garrett said. She closed her eyes. He watched her lips move, no sound, something private being offered to whatever receives private things. Then she opened her eyes and blew out the candle, and the cafe applauded again, and Bryn pumped her fist, and Nora laughed the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deeper than where people usually laugh from. Bryn insisted on dividing the cinnamon roll into 3 equal portions with the mathematical rigor of someone who understood that the equitable distribution of pastry was a moral issue. Garrett attempted to surrender his share to Nora. Bryn overruled him. They ate slowly, the 3 of them. Bryn narrating a new theory about whether cinnamon rolls were technically a breakfast food or a dessert food, and what that distinction meant for the ethics of eating them before noon, and Nora listening with the particular attention of someone who has been deprived of small, ordinary noise and is taking it in like water. The Saturday rush thinned. The cafe settled into its slower, quieter afternoon self. At some point, Bryn migrated to the project of decorating napkins with a pen. Garrett kept in his jacket pocket, and the table went to a different kind of quiet, the kind that had room in it. Nora looked out the window for a moment. Then she looked back at Garrett, and something in her expression had changed. The cautiousness still present, but something else present alongside it. Something that had made a decision. "Can I tell you something?" Her voice was low, meant only for this table. He nodded. "This table." She touched the edge of it, not the wobbling corner but the flat center with 2 fingers. "This exact table. It used to be ours. My family's. Every Saturday morning for 5 years. My parents and my little sister and me. We'd sit right here. My dad always ordered too much food. My mom always stole his coffee and pretended she hadn't. My sister Emma would always spill something in the first 10 minutes. Without fail. Every single time." Garrett was very still. "It was our place." Nora's voice did not break, but it moved closer to the edge of something. "We had a spot in the parking lot we always tried to get, and we'd walk in the same order, and my dad would do this thing where he'd announce our arrival, even though nobody cared, like we were royalty visiting, and Emma would be embarrassed and laugh at the same time." She stopped, started again quieter. 14 months ago there was a gas leak in our building. Faulty line, old pipes. The building inspectors called it a systemic failure, which is one of those phrases that sounds like it explains something but actually just means nobody specific is to blame. She was looking at her hands now. It exploded. Middle of the night. I was trapped under debris for several hours. When I woke up in the hospital, I'd lost my left leg below the knee. The sentence was delivered with the cadence of a fact that had been said so many times it had been worn smooth. And they told me my parents and Emma didn't make it. The background noise of the cafe continued. Someone's coffee order was called. The espresso machine completed a cycle. The world outside the window kept moving in the ordinary, oblivious way the world keeps moving. "I couldn't come back here," Nora said. "For a whole year I couldn't even drive past this street without my chest doing something I couldn't control. I tried once about 6 months after, and I had to pull over in the parking lot and just sit there until it stopped." She looked up at him. "But today I woke up and I just knew. I knew that if I didn't come back here, if I didn't sit at this table one more time, I was going to let it become something I was permanently afraid of." A pause. Something caught behind it. "I needed to be here, in this chair, at this table. I thought if I could just sit where we used to sit, maybe I could feel close to them for a minute. Maybe it would stop being a place I'd lost and start being a place I'd had." Garrett didn't say anything for a moment. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the things he wanted to say required more certainty than the moment had room for, and certainty was something he'd learned to be careful with. "It's not stupid," he said finally. "What you just described coming back here, it's not stupid. It felt stupid. When I was standing in the parking lot working up the nerve, it felt like the stupidest thing I'd ever decided to do." The almost smile again, briefer this time. "Every table turned me away. I thought maybe that was the universe telling me I was right the first time. The universe was wrong." Bryn, who had appeared to be fully absorbed in the napkin art project, looked up at this with the expression of someone who has been following a conversation while pretending not to. She considered Nora for a moment with the clear, unmediated assessment that 6-year-olds perform before social training teaches them to soften it. Then she put down her pen, walked around the table for the second time, and climbed directly into Nora's lap. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around Nora's neck and held on with the uncomplicated full-body commitment of a child who has decided that a person needs to be held and is going to do it. Nora went very still. Then her arms came up and she held Bryn back, and the quality of the sound she made not quite a sob, something quieter and deeper, something that had been sealed away for a long time, and had found through this small door, held open by a 6-year-old a way out, made Garrett have to look out the window for a moment. He reached across the table and took Nora's free hand and held it. Just held it. Nothing was said. The barista was wiping down the counter. The espresso machine had gone quiet. 2 tables over an older man was reading a newspaper with the absorbed patience of someone who understood that Saturday mornings were for exactly this kind of unhurried time. They stayed like that for a while. The world continued around them with its ordinary sounds, and at their corner table the wobbly one no one else wanted. Something was happening that didn't have a name but didn't need one. When Nora finally surfaced, she was still holding Bryn, but her breathing had steadied, and the devastation in her expression had changed into something that was not better exactly, but was different. The particular look of grief that has been witnessed rather than endured alone. "Thank you." It was directed at Garrett, then at Bryn, then at some general space between them. "For all of this. For the seat for the cake, for—" She made a small gesture that seemed to mean everything in the past 2 hours and more. "Just thank you. You said you needed to be here today," Bryn said from her position still in Nora's lap. "You should come here every Saturday. It's what we do. We always sit at this table." "Bryn," Garrett's voice was gentle, "she should know she's invited." Bryn looked at him with the patient expression of a person explaining something obvious. People need to know when they're invited. Garrett looked at Nora, who was watching Bryn with an expression that had several layers to it, something warm, something painful, something that was deciding something. "You're welcome back," Garrett said. "Any Saturday you want. No pressure either way." The cafe had thinned to its mid-morning quietude. The light through the window had moved to the angle that meant it was past 11. At some point during the past hour and 20 minutes, Garrett had stopped monitoring how long he'd been making 1 cup of coffee last, and had simply been here, which was different. Nora shifted Bryn gently to the chair beside her and reached for her crutches. "I should probably go. She said it like someone testing the idea, not fully committing to it yet. "Can you come to the park?" Bryn asked. "We always go to the park after. There's a swing I'm trying to get to go all the way around the top bar, but Daddy says physics won't allow it. I think physics is wrong." The laugh that came from Nora this time was smaller but more genuine, less surprised by itself. "I don't know about physics." She looked at Garrett. "It's just a couple of blocks," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She said it in a way that was making a distinction between don't have to and don't want to. Then she stood, settled the crutches under her arms with the confidence of someone who had been doing this long enough that the mechanics were no longer something she thought about. Okay. They left together. Bryn walked between them on the sidewalk, claiming one of Garrett's hands and one of Nora's, and narrating the observable world with the sustained enthusiasm of someone for whom the world was still reliably interesting. The sky had done that thing it sometimes did in Portland in early spring, where it offered actual sunlight as a kind of provisional gift, and the light on the sidewalk was the color of something that was trying. Garrett walked with his hands occupied and his notebook in his pocket, and the awareness somewhere in the back of his mind, where the things he wasn't ready to articulate lived, that this Saturday was distinct from the other Saturdays. That something had entered the ordinary rhythm of his weeks through a door he'd held open without fully knowing he was doing it, and that the fact of a door held open for someone who needed it, was probably the most purely correct thing he'd done in longer than he could immediately calculate. He didn't write that down. Some things weren't for the notebook yet. At the park, Bryn ran directly to the swings. Nora settled onto the bench nearby, her crutches propped at her side, and watched Bryn pump her legs with the determined engineering focus of a person who had not yet accepted that a full 360 around the top bar was structurally inadvisable. Garrett sat down on the bench beside Nora, leaving appropriate space, and they watched in silence for a moment. "She's extraordinary," Nora said. "She's relentless," Garrett said, and then amended. "They're the same thing mostly." Nora turned to look at him, and the afternoon light hit her face at the particular angle that showed how tired she was, and also something else, something that had been there all morning underneath the exhaustion, something that looked, when the light was right, like the beginning of a person who was not yet finished. "Why did you say yes?" she asked. "This morning at the café. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything." He thought about it the way he thought about things worth thinking about without rushing. "You looked like someone who'd used up everything getting to the door," he said. "And I had a chair." He paused. "I've been on the other side of that before. The standing there part. The needing someone to just say yes without an explanation. I remembered what that felt like." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for remembering." Bryn called out from the swing. Nora watched this, and then executed a jump dismount that was technically more ambitious than graceful landing, in a crouch that transitioned into standing with the practiced save of someone who had done this many times and had learned to commit to the landing. "Incredible," Nora called back, and meant it. They stayed until the light changed and the spring air remembered that it was still only March and had not actually committed to warmth. Bryn protested the departure with the standard contractual objections, which Garrett honored by allowing 2 more minutes on the swings before the final non-negotiable call. They walked Nora back toward the cafe parking lot. The route they'd taken reversed the light, now lower and more golden and less provisional than it had been on the way out. When they reached Nora's car, a dark blue sedan with a parking permit from a neighborhood Garrett recognized as being in southeast Portland, Bryn stopped and looked up at her with the expression that meant she was about to say something that mattered to her. "Will you come back next Saturday?" Nora's hand tightened on her crutch. "I don't know if—" "You should." Bryn was not asking. She had identified something and was now simply reporting it. "You should come back." Nora looked at Garrett, and in her eyes there was the same question she'd asked him at the cafe door that morning, the one that wasn't really about a chair. "You're welcome back," he said again. "Any Saturday." Nora nodded slowly, something deciding itself behind her eyes. "Okay, I'll try." Bryn hugged her once, quick and fierce, around the waist. Then she ran ahead to Garrett's car and began the elaborate process of buckling herself in, which she had decided at some point in the past year was a task she needed to perform independently and at her own pace. Garrett and Nora stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the mild, lengthening light. Today was supposed to be... Nora stopped. Started differently. I wasn't expecting today to be anything other than what I came here for. She looked at him, and there was something very clear in it, very direct. Thank you for making it something else. He didn't know what to say to that. He nodded because he meant something by it. She got in her car. He watched her drive away, and then he went to his own car where Bryn had finally succeeded with the seatbelt and was waiting with the patience of someone who had accomplished a thing and was ready to go home. As Garrett drove, he thought about what Nora had said about coming to the cafe, the phrase she hadn't finished, the thing she said the day wasn't expected to be. He thought about the canvas tote bag on the floor beside her feet, the way she'd set it down carefully like it held something important, the way she'd reached for it once briefly early on and then pulled her hand back. And he thought about the moment 6, maybe 7 minutes after she'd sat down when Bryn had knocked the bag with her foot while turning in her chair, and the bag had tipped sideways, and Garrett had reached down automatically to write it and felt through the canvas the rectangular solidity of a sealed envelope. He had not looked at it. He had simply set the bag upright and moved his hand away and brought his attention back to the table. But after they left the cafe, when he walked Bryn to the park, he had done something that he had not explained to Bryn and had not thought through particularly carefully, and that he was not sure he could have defended if asked to. He had gone back to the trash can on the sidewalk where Nora had paused on the way out, where she had reached into the bag and removed something and placed it through the opening at the top. He had reached in and taken it back out. It was the envelope, the one he'd felt through the canvas, white sealed, written on the front in careful handwriting, for whoever finds this. He had folded it once and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, the one that sat against his chest. He didn't open it. He didn't open it because it wasn't his, and because some things, once you know what they are, you can't unknow. But he also didn't put it back in the trash because something in him, some part that had been paying attention all morning to the specific weight Nora Castellan had been carrying, and the specific look of a person who had come to a place to do a thing that couldn't be undone, needed to hold on to it. Proof, he thought, though he couldn't yet have told anyone what he was keeping proof of or for whom. Bryn fell asleep in the back seat before they reached the freeway. Garrett drove through the greening Portland streets with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed flat against the left side of his chest, where the folded envelope sat in his inside pocket. And he thought about doors and chairs and the particular mathematics of a day that had been ordinary until it wasn't. He thought about a 6-year-old reading a room without anyone teaching her how and making a decision that was more accurate than most adults could manage. He thought about the way Nora had looked when the whole cafe sang to her that fractured, disbelieving, reluctant joy. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where he kept the things he wasn't ready to look at directly, he thought about the empty chair in his kitchen, the one at the table, the one he'd been setting out for 2 years without being able to explain to anyone, including himself, why he kept doing it. He drove. Bryn breathed in the back seat. The city moved past the windows in the particular amber of a March afternoon running out of light. The envelope stayed in his pocket. The second Saturday arrived the way second Saturdays do when you have been paying attention to whether they will arrive slowly and then all at once. Garrett woke at 6:53, which was earlier than necessary, and lay in the pre-light listening to the building settle around him, telling himself that the low-grade alertness in his chest was just coffee withdrawal and not anything more specific than that. He was not convincing. Bryn had asked about Nora every single day of the intervening week, not obsessively, not with anxiety, but with the calm regularity of someone tracking a thing she considered factual. Tuesday morning over cereal. Do you think Nora likes maple syrup or regular syrup? Thursday in the car after school I told my friend Petra about Nora, and Petra said she sounds like a real person. And I said, obviously she's a real person. Friday at bedtime with the gravity of someone raising a procedural concern. What if she comes early and we're not there yet? Garrett had answered each one with the patience he'd trained himself to sustain and the private awareness that he was running the same calculation Bryn was running, just not out loud. He made Bryn's hot chocolate with actual milk this week. He had budgeted for it. By 9:15, Bryn had her face pressed against the passenger window watching the street for Nora's dark blue sedan. The morning was overcast in the particular Portland way that carried no threat, just the ordinary gray ceiling of the season. Riverside had its usual Saturday volume, and their table, the wobbly corner one, was empty. Bryn had stationed herself at the window with her hot chocolate when the bell above the door rang at 9:28. Nora came through it 2 minutes early, which Bryn announced to the general café before Nora had fully cleared the entrance. She was wearing a blue sweater today, something soft and loose, and the dark circles hadn't fully resolved, but they had receded. When she saw Bryn already in motion across the café, something opened in her expression that had been closed last week. Or not closed exactly, but not yet ready to be open. She braced her crutches and caught Bryn, and Bryn said, "You came back," in the tone of someone whose confidence had been total, but is still gratified by confirmation. And Nora said, "I told you I would," and that was settled. They fell back into the configuration of the week before with the ease of something that had already established its own gravity. Garrett with his black coffee, Bryn with her hot chocolate, Nora ordering a real coffee this time, an Americano, 2 sugars, her hands only slightly unsteady when she passed her card across the counter. Bryn talked. Nora listened with a quality that had nothing performed in it, the kind that asked follow-up questions, and remembered details, and treated a 6-year-old's account of classroom geopolitics as the primary text it deserved to be. It was not until Bryn took her hot chocolate to the counter to interrogate the barista about latte art, a project she had apparently been developing for weeks, that Nora looked across the table at Garrett and said quietly, "Thank you for last week. You already thanked me." "I know. I'm doing it again." She turned her coffee cup in a slow quarter circle. "I went home and slept for 11 hours. I haven't done that in over a year." He didn't know how to answer that without making it either too small or too large, so he nodded in the way that meant he'd received it fully. They went to the park after, same as the week before, and the week after that was the same as that. And by the 4th Saturday something had quietly shifted from invitation to expectation, from courtesy to routine. Nora arrived at 9:28. Bryn spotted her from the window. They sat at the wobbly table and ordered their drinks, and stayed until the Saturday crowd thinned to the unhurried midday version. Then walked to the park and watched Bryn attempt physics-defying feats on the swing set. Then said goodbye in the parking lot and drove to their separate parts of the city. Except that the texts had started. First, a photograph Nora sent on a Tuesday. No caption. Just a specific quality of morning light through a studio window, the kind that had texture and direction. Garrett wrote back, "That's a good light?" She wrote, "I almost painted it." He waited overnight before writing, "Why almost?" She didn't answer until the next morning. "I'll tell you Saturday." He found himself looking forward to Saturday in a way that had a specific object attached to it, which was different from the general way he'd been doing it for 2 years. By the 3rd week of texts, they were talking past 10 on weeknights. And by the 4th week, Nora had called him on a Wednesday evening. Therapy had excavated something she wasn't ready to put back cleanly, she said. She didn't want to talk about the session itself. She just needed to hear another person's voice while she sat in her apartment in southeast Portland and let the day finish. Garrett set down his grading and they talked about everything and nothing for 2 hours. The way people talk when the conversation is really about something else and both of them know it, and neither says so. It was a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of April when Nora came to the apartment for the first time. Bryn had a reading assignment she was resistant to, and Garrett had mentioned in passing that Nora had studied literature at the University of Oregon before her life reorganized itself. Bryn had issued what she described as an open invitation and what Garrett recognized as a summons. Nora texted an hour later, "I was told there's a mandatory reading situation. Should I bring anything?" He wrote back, "Just you." She arrived with a box of crackers and the focused calm she carried on good days, which he'd learned to distinguish from her managed calm days by the quality of ease in her hands. She sat across from Bryn at the kitchen table, and they worked through the assignment at a pace that was dignified, unhurried. And when Bryn's questions migrated off topic, which happened within 6 minutes, Nora followed them with the ease of someone who remembered what learning actually looked like versus what it was required to look like on paper. Garrett stood at the sink doing dishes and not watching them, which was to say he was watching them the particular way Nora's attention moved with Bryn, tracking her without managing her present in the way that some adults never learned and some understood instinctively. Then Nora went quiet. He glanced over and found her looking at the kitchen table arrangement, at the fourth chair, the one across from Bryn's. Positioned at the table with the 2-inch gap that separated a chair in use from a chair being kept. Not pushed under, not angled away. Set at the table the way you set a place when someone is expected. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at Garrett with a question she didn't ask. Old habit, he said. It wasn't an answer. They both knew it wasn't. And the restraint they both observed, neither pushing further, was its own kind of acknowledgement. The kind that says, I see this, and I'm going to let you carry it until you're ready to set it down. Bryn declared the session the best reading event in recorded history and asked if Nora could come back Thursday. Garrett said that was up to Nora. Nora said she'd come back Thursday. And that was how Thursday evenings became a thing, alongside Saturday mornings, alongside the texts and the late calls, alongside the accumulating ordinary weight of a person becoming present in a life. Mrs. Adelaide Frost lived 2 floors below them. Retired mid-70s, the kind of woman who kept a dish of hard candy by her door and had opinions about everything, and was right about most of it. She had introduced herself to Garrett 3 weeks after he moved in by bringing a casserole and explaining that she'd heard Bryn through the ceiling and had decided to establish diplomatic relations early. She adored Bryn with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had grandchildren in another state and was not about to let geography deprive her of the experience. By the time the Thursday evening started, it was already established that when Garrett needed coverage, Mrs. Frost was the first call, and that Bryn considered the arrangement a reasonable trade for access to the hard candy dish and Mrs. Frost's extensive collection of nature documentaries. It was a Thursday afternoon in planning period when his phone rang, and the name on the screen contracted the room slightly around him. Diana. She called on Sunday evenings as a rule. Brief calls, Bryn-facing, the kind that lasted 7 minutes if Bryn was lucky. This was a Thursday afternoon. Garrett let it ring 3 times before answering. Diana's voice carried the register she used for prepared conversations, smooth, deliberate, already past the pleasantries before she offered them. She said she had news. She would be in Portland next week, she said, sometime between commitments, and she'd love to see Bryn. She mentioned third sentence of a longer sequence, something about a school evaluation standard she'd read about, a new framework for assessing educational environments, an article she was happy to forward. Garrett had taught enough history to recognize when specific vocabulary was being road-tested in casual conversation. Educational environment, assessment, evaluation. These were not the words of a woman who wanted to take her daughter to lunch. These were the opening phrases of a different kind of music entirely, and he knew the key it was written in. He said that would be fine. He kept his voice at the same temperature throughout. When he hung up, he sat in his empty classroom for 4 minutes looking at the whiteboard where he'd written Reconstruction Failures, Causes and Consequences in dry erase marker that morning, and the words took on a quality they hadn't possessed when he'd written them. He didn't tell Nora that night when she called. He meant to. He had the moment prepared after the first 10 minutes when they'd settled into the easy back and forth that had become the texture of their evenings. He would say it plainly, just as information. But Nora had had a genuinely good day, and she was handling it with the careful happiness of a person who had not had many good days recently and understood that they needed to be held gently. He didn't put Diana's call into that space. He told himself it was consideration. He knew somewhere more honest that it was also fear of what the telling might cost. He didn't tell Bryn until Sunday. He chose his words with the care he used when preparing to say something that would land in a child who paid closer attention than most adults. Bryn received it with a stillness that was unlike her usual processing. No immediate questions, no rapid recalibration, just a pause that lasted several seconds. Then her whole face changed the way a room changes when someone turns on a light that has been off for a long time. And what came into it was a joy so unguarded it pressed something behind Garrett's sternum in a place that had been tender for 2 years. "Is she coming home?" The word home did its small violence quietly and was gone. "She's visiting sweetheart. She wants to see you. But maybe she'll want to stay." Bryn said it not as certainty, but as a door she was opening cautiously, testing the hinge. "Maybe she'll see how good everything is." Garrett looked at his daughter and made the calculation parents make when protection and honesty require the same answer delivered with different hands. "We don't know what she's thinking yet. But she wants to see you. That part's real." Bryn nodded, absorbing. "Then, can I tell Nora? Let's wait until after the visit." "Okay, let's see how it goes first." He should have known that waiting is not a strategy 6-year-olds honor beyond the duration of their immediate interest in honoring it. The following Saturday, Diana's visit was 2 days away. Garrett had decided to say nothing to Nora until after. A decision based partly on logic and partly on the fact that he hadn't yet worked out what exactly there was to say. They were at Riverside. Everything normal. Their table, their drinks. Bryn narrating the latest chapter of the Scissors saga. When Bryn, in the frictionless way children move between topics, looked up at Nora and said, "Guess what? My mom is coming to Portland. She's going to visit, and Daddy says maybe, which I think means probably, and maybe we'll all be a real family again." The sentence had 6 clauses and took 4 seconds. And Garrett watched Nora's face the way he'd watched the café when Bryn started singing on the first Saturday, anticipating the impact, unable to prevent it. Nora didn't flinch. She held the expression she was wearing, held it intact and present. And what happened was, not that it changed, but that something behind it did, quietly and completely, the way a light source behind a curtain goes out. The warmth in her eyes remained in form, but not in quality. The difference between a fire burning and a very accurate painting of one. "That's really exciting," Nora said, and her voice was steady and real, and cost her something to make that way. "I'm really happy for you, Bryn. You'll still be our friend, though, right? You'll still come on Saturdays?" "Of course, sweetheart," Nora smiled at Bryn. "Always." They left earlier than usual. Bryn, too, energized to sit. In the parking lot, Nora was present and kind, and looked at Bryn when Bryn spoke to her, and did not look at Garrett. Not once. Not directly. And he understood that she had already made a decision and was protecting herself from the conversation that might complicate it. She hugged Bryn goodbye. She nodded at Garrett, brief and careful. She got in her car and drove away. He stood in the parking lot for a moment after Bryn had climbed into his car, holding the specific weight of the mistake he had made without quite making it, the mistake of omission, of letting something land on Nora without warning or preparation. The texts that week were shorter, further apart. By Friday, the silence had the texture of a communication rather than an absence. On Saturday, he and Bryn went to Riverside and sat at their table, and Bryn pressed her face to the window, and Nora didn't come. An hour passed. Then another. "She's not coming, is she?" Bryn said it not as a question, but as a conclusion she had been working toward. Maybe something came up. She would have texted. Bryn said it with the flat certainty of someone who had paid attention to how things worked between people and was now applying that knowledge. "She always texts." She was right. Garrett sent a message at 10:15, "Bryn's asking about you. Everything okay?" And received nothing until late afternoon. "I'm fine. Just needed a day." He wrote back, "We'll be here next week." The silence that followed was its own answer. She didn't come the next Saturday either. By Monday, he was operating at the functional level of concern that requires action. He arranged coverage for his lunch period and drove to Southeast Portland, climbed the 3 exterior flight stairs built before anyone thought seriously about access, and he felt a specific anger on Nora's behalf at every step which he set aside because it wasn't the priority, and knocked on her door. Nothing. Then the door opened. She looked like the interior of someone who had been spending everything on internal processes and had nothing left for the exterior ones. Her apartment had its curtains drawn against a Tuesday noon that was trying to be bright, and her canvases were turned to face the wall. All of them. which was a change from the last time he'd been here, a significant one. Her art supplies sat gathered on the table in the way of a person who intended to do something with them and had not yet done it. You weren't at the cafe. I know. I'm sorry. I just needed some time. You didn't answer my texts. I know. She held the door at the angle of a person who hadn't decided yet. I'm fine, Garrett. I needed space to figure some things out. Can I come in? She stepped back. He didn't sit immediately. He looked at the turned canvases, the gathered supplies, the drawn curtains, and he looked at her, at the woman who had been choosing every Saturday for 6 weeks to come back, and said, Bryn's upset. I know. That's partly why She stopped. Started differently. I didn't want to make it harder by staying and then having to pull back anyway. Pulling back from what Nora turned to face him fully, and in her eyes was the thing he'd been afraid was there. Not anger, which he could have met, but resolved sadness. The expression of someone who has completed the reasoning and arrived at a conclusion and is now trying to deliver it kindly. Your ex-wife is coming back. You told Bryn maybe, which means you're considering it. A little girl should have both her parents together if she can. Her voice had the steadiness of someone speaking from a rehearsed place rather than a raw one. I'm not going to be the reason that doesn't happen. Diana and I are not getting back together. But you're thinking about it. For Bryn. I'm thinking about what's best for Bryn. Those are not the same thing. Bryn wants her mom back. I saw her face. Bryn wants the idea of it. The version where her family looks like other families. That's different from wanting what Diana and I actually produce when we occupy the same space for longer than an hour. The words came out harder than intended, carrying compressed weight. He brought himself down from it. I know that, and I need you to let me know it. Nora's arms crossed. Not defensive. The way people hold themselves when they're trying to keep something in. What if I'm using you? What if I'm using both of you to replace what I lost? And I'm not healing. I'm hiding inside your life because it's warmer than mine, and one day you'll see it, and I'll have already made Bryn believe in something that isn't real. Nothing about the past 6 weeks has been hiding. You can't know that. I might not know it either. He looked at her. At the turned canvases. At the untouched supplies. At the woman who had come into his life carrying an envelope she'd been willing to throw away and had been choosing every week to put further behind her. The person who hides doesn't call twice a week to say what's actually happening inside them. The person who hides doesn't let a 6-year-old into their lap the first time they've been in the same room. Nora looked away. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, Garrett said. I'm asking you not to make the decision for everyone without asking them. Bryn gets a vote. I get a vote. You don't get to determine what's best for us and then disappear as the delivery mechanism. The silence that followed was the working kind, the kind that meant something was being processed rather than defended against. Nora's arms loosened. She sat on the edge of the couch and looked at the floor and then at him. I don't know how to do this without being afraid of it. I don't either. He sat down across from her. I've been afraid of it since the second Saturday. Something moved in her face. Surprise. And underneath it something cautious and real beginning to surface. The second Saturday. You came back when you didn't have to. That was the moment it stopped being a coffee table. She was quiet again, but differently quiet. The quality of a room when someone opens a window. He reached into his jacket and took out the notebook. He'd been carrying it for 40 minutes, knowing he might show it to her. And for 6 weeks before that, knowing he might someday have to. He opened it to the back page. Not Bryn's words, not the accumulated record of a daughter growing, but the single entry in the lower corner, written small the way you write something you're not sure has earned its space. He held it out. Nora looked at the page. She read it once and then she read it again. The way you read something when the first reading doesn't fully land because what it says is too far from what you expected. Her lips moved slightly on the second pass following the words. She threw the letter away. I kept it because someone should. Because she deserves to have someone who believes she's worth keeping. The silence that came after was not the processing kind. It was the kind that means something has arrived, and the person receiving it needs a moment before they can look at you again. You wrote that the first day, she said finally. Yes, before you knew anything about me. I knew enough. He held her gaze. I knew you came back from the trash can. That was enough. Her eyes were bright in the way that was close to tears but hadn't crossed yet. She looked at the notebook, then at him, and something in her expression shifted with the specific quality of a wall that has been leaning against its own weight for a long time and has finally, in one quiet moment, decided to come down. I'm coming back Saturday. Not a question or a request. The sound of a decision that had been made before she said it and was now simply being reported. I know. I can't promise I won't get scared again. I know that too. He stood, and she stood, and in the small apartment they were closer than they'd been in any space outside the café, the air between them carrying the specific charge of something identified and not yet addressed. But you have to come back and be scared here instead of disappearing and being scared alone. That's the difference. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that he had to be paying attention to catch it. That's asking a lot. It's asking exactly enough. He left with the afternoon still active around him, and the knowledge solid and slightly terrifying that something had moved across a line in the past 40 minutes. Not into anything named, but out of what could still be called uncertainty. He taught his afternoon classes with the divided attention of a man whose mind was in two places at once, both of them real. That evening after Bryn was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open. He had never written anything in it about himself. The notebook was Bryn's, her words, her observations, the things she said that he wanted preserved against the forward movement of time. He had never considered it a place for anything else, and the single back-page entry had felt when he wrote it like a trespass he was committing anyway because some things needed to exist somewhere outside of a person's own head. He closed it, put it back in his jacket pocket. On the counter his phone lit up. One line time-stamped 10:47. See you Saturday. He read it and set the phone face down and went to check that Bryn's covers were straight because she kicked them to the bottom of the bed by midnight without fail. And this was the thing he did every night, this small, unremarkable act of making sure. And tonight, like every night, it was enough. The kitchen table still had its empty chair. He sat across from it in the quiet apartment and thought about the notebook entry, and the way Nora had read it twice, and the specific quality of the silence that had followed. He thought about what it meant that he had been carrying that page in his jacket for 6 weeks without knowing whether he would ever show it to anyone. He thought about the studio he'd been sitting in, the paintings on Nora's studio wall. Every one of them had a window. He had registered this as aesthetic signature, as stylistic choice, as the mark of a particular sensibility. But sitting in that wooden corner chair week after week, he had started to understand it as something else. The visual language of a person who had survived something unsurvivable and was still in every piece looking for a way that light came in. Not a way through, a way in. There was a difference, and he had felt it without being able to name it until now. He wondered in the dark kitchen with its empty fourth chair what it would look like if she ever painted a door. Outside, Portland moved through its Tuesday evening, indifferent and continuing. He left the chair where it was, but he sat there a little longer than usual before he went to bed. In the way a person sits when they understand that something is ending and something else is beginning, and both of those facts are true at the same time. She came back on Saturday. Garrett was at the counter when the bell above the door rang, and Bryn abandoned the patience exercise she had been performing for 40 minutes. And crossed the cafe with the full-speed commitment she reserved for things that mattered enough to eliminate the concept of obstacles between here and there. Nora caught her, braced her crutches and shifted her weight in the way she had learned to do, and held Bryn with both arms while her face did something over Bryn's shoulder that Garrett, watching from the counter, let pass without comment because it was the kind of thing that deserved its privacy even across a room. You didn't come last week. Bryn set it into Nora's shoulder. I know, I'm sorry. Nora pulled back enough to look at Bryn directly. When I'm scared, I'm supposed to tell my friends instead of disappearing. That's the rule now. That's been the rule the whole time. The exasperation in Bryn's voice was the specific kind reserved for things that should have been obvious. Pinky promise you'll follow it. Nora held out her hand. Bryn linked their pinkies with the gravity of someone sealing something that would be held too. And that was settled. They found their table. The cafe moved around them in its Saturday rhythm, and within 4 minutes Bryn had delivered a full briefing on the week's developments, including the resolution of the scissors situation through unexpected diplomacy, and the emergence of a class hamster named Brigadier, who had achieved minor celebrity by escaping his enclosure during a math lesson. Nora listened with the focused ease of someone who had moved past performing engagement into simply having it, and Garrett watched the difference. Not the careful attention of the early weeks, which had been real, but effortful, but something that had settled into its own natural weight. He had not yet told Nora about Diana's visit. He had carried it through the 8 days of her absence, and now through this return Saturday, waiting for the right space. The visit had happened on a Wednesday afternoon at a park on the west side of the city. Neutral ground arranged through careful text messages. He had bought Bryn ice cream before Diana arrived, primarily to give her hands something to hold. Diana had come precisely on time in the composed and well-dressed way she brought to occasions she had prepared for, and Bryn had gone very still beside Garrett when she spotted her mother across the grass. That particular stillness of a child whose imagined version of a moment is about to make contact with its actual version. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Diana asked questions with the attentiveness of someone who had prepared them in advance. Bryn answered in shorter sentences than usual, the register she used when she was being careful rather than enthusiastic. In the car afterward, Bryn had been quiet in the processing way. And then she had said to the window rather than to Garrett, "She feels like someone I knew a long time ago and can't completely remember." He had pulled over for that one, had sat on the shoulder of the road until he was confident his voice would come out level. He had called Diana that evening. The conversation had been brief and direct in a way their marriage had rarely managed. He had said clearly that he wanted Bryn to have a relationship with her mother, that he would support every arranged visit, that he would facilitate everything in good faith. He had said with equal clarity that there was nothing between them worth attempting to reconstruct, that trying for Bryn's sake would produce the same outcome it had produced before, only this time with a 6-year-old present for the structural failure. Diana had been quiet, and then said with the precision of someone identifying a variable, "Is there someone else?" He had told her that was no longer her concern. She had ended the call at a pace that suggested she disagreed with that assessment, but she had ended it. When Bryn migrated to the counter to investigate latte art technique, a project she had been developing across several Saturdays, Garrett looked at Nora across the table and told her all of it, plainly, without management, the way he had learned she preferred things delivered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup. "You're sure?" She said it not as a question about Diana completely. About the rest. He held her gaze. "I know what direction I'm going. I'm less certain I'm handling all of it right." Nora turned her cup a slow quarter circle. "Nobody's doing it right. We're both just not leaving." He drove home that afternoon with those words arranged in his chest in a way that had nothing temporary about it. The Friday studio evenings had started in the second week of May, an evolution rather than a plan. Garrett would leave Bryn with Mrs. Frost 2 floors down, who had made clear that Bryn's visits were the entertainment highlight of her week, and he would drive to Southeast Portland and climb the 3 flights and sit in the wooden chair in the corner of Nora's studio while she worked. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes the studio held a productive quiet, and in either state something was being built that didn't require narration to progress. It was on one of these Fridays in the 3rd week of May that Nora mentioned the gallery email. She was standing in front of her wall of finished canvases, not painting, just looking. The considering posture rather than the evaluating one. A gallery on the East Side contacted me 3 weeks ago. They saw a photograph of one of these online. She didn't specify which. The person said every piece has a window. She wants to know what's on the other side. He waited. "I haven't answered yet." She turned from the wall. "I don't know if I'm ready. You don't have to be ready." He held her gaze from across the studio. "You just have to show up." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression she wore when something had landed accurately. Then she sat down on the paint-spattered stool and was quiet in the way that builds toward a decision rather than away from one. She answered the email the following morning. The show was scheduled for the third Friday in June, 6 weeks out. Enough time for 3 new pieces and the 16 days of doubt that Garrett observed from a respectful distance while making clear in practical rather than verbal ways that he did not share the doubt. He arranged for Mrs. Frost on the evening of the opening. He let Bryn spend 22 minutes selecting a card at Powell's, understanding that she grasped the card as frame rather than gift. On the night itself, he arrived with Bryn in her purple sweater, both of them slightly early, and found Nora already in conversation with the gallery owner. She was not using her crutches. Over the preceding 3 weeks, she had been transitioning to the prosthetic for extended standing. He had watched the adjustment happen gradually, the small recalibrations, the occasional frustration, the increasing ease, and tonight she had committed to it for the duration, standing with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is honoring it with their body. Garrett walked through the paintings with Bryn at his side, both of them quiet in the way the work required. He had seen most of these canvases individually in the variable light of Friday evenings, and he had believed he knew them. Seen together in sequence, they revealed a logic that individual viewing had concealed. The early pieces were dense and chaotic at their centers, the light sources in them accidental, the darkness total in the corners. Then, a shift so gradual it was nearly imperceptible canvas to canvas but undeniable across the full sequence. The compositions opening, the darkness becoming structured, the light sources becoming chosen rather than stumbled upon. The final piece hung at the turning point between the main room and the secondary space, positioned so that you came upon it at an angle before turning to face it fully. Every painting Nora had made contained windows, always windows, light entering from outside, landing on an interior surface, a person inside receiving what came through glass from somewhere beyond the frame. This one had a door, open fully, not ajar, but completely open the way a door stands when whoever walked through it had no intention of returning to close it. The light on both sides matched outside and inside, equally luminous, the same quality and temperature, so that the doorway was not a threshold between darkness and brightness, but between 2 versions of warmth. The empty opening at the center of the canvas had the quality of an invitation rather than a departure, something still possible rather than already completed. The title card read, Saturday. Bryn stood in front of it without speaking, which was its own form of response. Later in the evening, when a cluster of people had gathered in the secondary room and Nora was occupied with the gallery owner near the entrance, Garrett found a quiet moment and a brief word with the woman managing the sales list. He handed her his card. She looked at him and then at the card and recalibrated something in her expression and nodded once. He told no one. He went back to where Bryn was still positioned in front of Saturday and put his hand on her shoulder, and they stood there together until Nora found them. She had been approached about the painting 3 times during the evening. She told him later 2 potential buyers, one person who wanted to discuss it at length. She had told all 3 it wasn't available, operating on an instinct she couldn't have named. Near the end of the opening, the gallery owner had found her and told her quietly that it had been purchased earlier in the evening by the man who arrived with the small girl in the purple sweater. Nora came to him where he was standing near the back wall. Her eyes had the brightness that preceded tears, but hadn't arrived there yet, controlled by effort. You bought it. You needed to know that the darkest thing you've ever made is still worth something. He held her gaze without qualification. You are still worth something. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder briefly, the gesture of a person who has not yet fully learned to need things in front of other people but is practicing. The weight of it lasted 3 seconds and contained everything that a longer declaration would have taken paragraphs to approximate. Then she straightened because there were people and because she was still learning. But she didn't move away, and he didn't step back, and they stood together in the warm noise of the gallery, while Bryn circulated with the confidence of a person who understood she was in a room full of adults who could be approached about art. The weeks between the opening and August moved in the way that summer weeks move when something is being quietly built, full of ordinary days that are doing more work than they appear to be doing. Nora began spending more nights at the apartment than at her studio. Garrett noticed the accumulation. A second toothbrush that appeared without announcement on the bathroom shelf in early July. 3 of her plants arranged on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light was better than anywhere in her studio. A particular coffee mug she had claimed, and that had stopped going home with her. He noticed all of it and said nothing because the accumulation itself was the conversation and it didn't need translation. Bryn noticed too. She catalogued it with the satisfaction of a person watching a prediction come true and confined her commentary to a single observation delivered one evening while Nora was helping her with a summer reading assignment at the kitchen table. "You have a lot of stuff here now." It was not a complaint. It was the tone of someone filing a fact that confirmed something they had known for some time. Nora had looked at the plant on the windowsill and then at Bryn and said, "Is that okay?" Bryn had returned to her book. Obviously. In the second week of August, Diana Lawson sat across a table from Garrett and a family law attorney in a mediator's office in Northwest Portland. The meeting had been Diana's request, made through her lawyer 3 weeks prior, with the formal language that suggested she had been preparing for this conversation for some time. Garrett had spent those 3 weeks running scenarios. Most of them involved Diana attempting to renegotiate custody. Some involved her requesting relocation with Bryn to wherever she was currently living. A few, the ones that arrived at 3 in the morning when his mind was least defended, involved courtrooms and depositions and the particular violence of a system that treats children as divisible assets. None of them involved what actually happened. Diana came to the meeting differently than he had expected. Not softer exactly, but less armored, the quality of someone who had been doing work that was beginning to show. She had asked about Bryn before the mediator and lawyers arrived. Genuinely asked. With the particular attention of a person who has been practicing listening rather than managing. She had known Bryn's current favorite color. Garrett had noticed her knowing it without remarking on it, but he had noticed. When the mediator called them to order, Diana spoke first. "I've been working with a therapist for the past 6 months. Not court-mandated. My choice." She looked at the table rather than at Garrett. She asked me what I actually wanted from this, and I realized I'd been operating from the wrong question. I was asking how to get Bryn back. The real question was, what does Bryn need and can I provide it better than what she already has? Diana's hands were folded on the table, the knuckles slightly white. The answer is no. She's happy. She's stable. She has a routine and a school and people who show up for her consistently. And she has a pause. She has Nora, who Bryn talks about the way children talk about people who have actually shown up. Garrett said nothing. The mediator made a small note. Diana continued, "I'm not here to fight for custody. I'm here to formalize what's already working. Bryn stays with you. I want a visitation schedule that I can actually keep, something realistic, and I want it in writing so Bryn knows I'm not going to disappear again." The room held that statement for a moment. Garrett found his voice. "Why now?" "Because 2 weeks ago Bryn told me she loves me but she doesn't miss me. And when I asked her what the difference was, she said, 'Missing is when you're sad someone's gone. I'm not sad, you're just someone I see sometimes.'" Diana's eyes were bright but dry. "My therapist asked how that made me feel, and I said it felt like failure. And she said no. It feels like honesty. Your daughter is secure enough to tell you the truth. That's not failure. That's what happens when you're not the center of her world anymore, and that's okay." The custody agreement was signed 40 minutes later. The terms were straightforward. Bryn with her father in Portland. Diana with a structured visitation schedule that she had designed herself with her therapist, realistic commitments she could meet, rather than aspirational ones she would break. When the pen came up from the page, Diana sat back and looked at the signature for a moment. "She's happy," she said more to herself than to Garrett. "I can see it every time I see her. She is." The woman. Nora. Diana looked at him directly now. "I know I said things about her that were about me and not about her. And I know I never said them to her directly. But—" a pause that contained something that had required real effort to arrive at. "Bryn talks about her the way I wish she talked about me. And I'm—" another pause. "I'm glad she has that. I needed to say that to someone even if it isn't to her." Garrett looked at his ex-wife and recognized beneath the composed surface the specific tiredness of someone genuinely in the middle of changing rather than merely intending to. It was not forgiveness, which was a larger and slower thing than a single conversation could carry, but it was something honest, and he received it as such. "I'll tell her you said it." He drove home through the August morning with the windows down and the city moving past in the particular way it moved when summer was at its fullest, and the light had the quality of something that understood it was temporary and was being generous anyway. When he walked into the apartment, Nora was at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee she had made in the mug that had stopped going home with her, surrounded on three sides by the plants that had migrated from the studio over the preceding weeks. She was reading something on her phone and looked up when he came in. And the ease of the looking up, the absence of anything other than simple acknowledgement in it, the absence of performance or adjustment, was its own complete sentence about what the past months had built. He told her about Diana. All of it, including the part about Bryn being happy, including the part about Diana knowing Bryn's favorite color, including the apology that had been directed at the table rather than at Nora directly, but had been meant for her. Nora listened with her mug held in both hands. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. "Tell her she doesn't owe me anything. But tell her I heard it." Bryn was at day camp until noon, which meant the apartment had the specific quality of quiet it held, without her orderly in a way it never was when she was present, the silence slightly too complete. Garrett sat down at the kitchen table and Nora brought her coffee and sat across from him, and they existed in the easy wordlessness that had become, over months, its own reliable language. The kitchen table had 4 chairs. 3 were occupied in their established configuration. The fourth, the one that had been positioned at the table for 2 years, always sat at a distance, suggesting someone about to return, rather than someone who had left, sat where it had always sat, unchanged. Nora looked at it. Garrett followed her gaze. He reached over and pushed the chair in fully flush with the table's edge, the way chairs sit when they are simply chairs and not the physical form of an absence. He did it with one hand without ceremony and brought his hand back and set it on the table. Nora watched his hand return. She set down her mug. "Are we going to say the thing we haven't said yet?" Her voice was direct, which was how she said things when they mattered. "Which thing?" "The permanent thing." She held his gaze with the steadiness she brought to what was real. "The thing where this stops being something we're building toward and becomes the thing itself." "I was waiting for you to be ready. I've been ready for a while." Something in her expression had the quality of a door that has been considered at length and is now standing open. "I think I was waiting for you to stop waiting." He looked at her across the kitchen table, at the woman who had walked into his life through a cafe door carrying a weight she'd been prepared to set down permanently, who had chosen every Saturday to come back when nothing required it, whose grief had become paintings that made people go quiet, who had learned the specific physics of his daughter's embraces and received every one of them as the gift it was. He looked at the mug that had stopped going home, the plants on the sill, the toothbrush, the particular morning ease of her presence in a space that had been organized around an absence for 2 years. Stay. Not some of the time. All of it. Whatever it becomes, stay for it. Nora's eyes did the thing they did when she had lost the argument with herself about not crying. Not dramatically. Just the quiet overflow of someone whose defenses had been gradually and willingly dismantled over the course of months. "That's not a question." "No," he said, "it isn't." She reached across the table and took his hand, and the morning light came through the kitchen window at the angle it came through in August, warm and unhurried, landing on the table between their hands. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They were still sitting there when Bryn came home at noon with paint on both forearms and an elaborate account of a turtle that had visited the nature station at camp, who she had named Gerald, and who had displayed what she described as an unusually thoughtful temperament for a reptile. She walked into the kitchen and stopped when she saw them, registered the joined hands on the table and the quality of the room, and performed the rapid assessment she had been performing since she was old enough to read the emotional weather of a space. Finally. She said it with the satisfaction of someone whose patience had been both extensive and entirely justified. She dropped her backpack on the floor, which she had been told not to do, and climbed into her chair. "Are we doing pancakes?" "We should do pancakes." "It's noon," Garrett said. "Pancakes don't have a time." Bryn looked at Nora with the authority of someone calling on a reliable vote. "Tell him." Nora kept her face composed for approximately 1 second. "Pancakes don't have a time." Garrett stood to get the flour, and Bryn scrambled up to assist in the way that made the task take longer and better, and Nora moved to find the eggs in the kitchen filled with the layered, ordinary noise of 3 people making something together. The specific sound of a Saturday morning that had migrated into a weekday, into a Tuesday in August, because the things worth doing didn't wait for the correct day of the week anymore. At some point in the organized chaos of batter and disagreement about flipping technique, Bryn glanced at the kitchen table, at the chair that was now pushed in, aligned with the others, and something passed across her face. Not surprise. She had been watching this unfold for months with the particular attention of someone who understood that important things happen slowly and then all at once. She caught Garrett's eye and smiled, and in that smile was everything she had learned about how the world worked when you paid attention to the people in it. The pancakes were uneven because the committee had not reached consensus on technique. They ate them at the kitchen table, all 3, with the maple syrup that had been established as objectively correct. And Bryn told them everything she knew about Gerald the turtle, which was substantial, and the August light held for the whole morning in the generous way of late summer light that knows what's coming and is being deliberate about what it offers now. Nobody mentioned anything that had been hard. The hard things had been said in the right moments and in the right rooms, and had done their necessary work, and they didn't need to be carried into this one. When the plates were cleared, Bryn leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a person taking inventory of current conditions and finding them satisfactory. "Same thing next Saturday." Garrett looked at Nora across the table. Nora looked at him with the expression she had on the days when everything she was feeling was fully visible, and she had stopped trying to manage whether it showed. Every week. Bryn nodded as though this confirmed what she already knew, which it did, and pushed back from the table to go find her notebook and record her observations about Gerald before the details deteriorated, which she had explained was a real risk with memory, and the kitchen settled into the quiet of a house that has enough people in it. Garrett stood and began clearing the plates. Nora rose to help, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen with the easy choreography of people who had learned each other's rhythms. The chair that had been empty for 2 years sat at the table with the others. Not remarkable, not weighted, not a monument to what had been absent. Just a chair. Outside Portland moved through its August Tuesday with the unhurried confidence of a city in its best season, and the light continued to come through the kitchen window at the angle that made everything look like it had been considered and found sufficient. Nora dried the last plate and set it in the cabinet. She turned and leaned against the counter, watching Garrett wipe down the table, including the 4th chair, which he cleaned with the same casual attention he gave the others, as though it had always been part of the set. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He looked up at her. At the woman standing in his kitchen with dish soap on her wrist and afternoon light in her hair, and the particular expression of someone who was home. "I'm thinking about the envelope. The one you kept." "Yeah." He set down the cloth. "I kept it because I thought someone should believe you were worth keeping, and I didn't know yet that you'd be the one who figured that out." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I think we both figured it out," she said. "You just started earlier." Bryn's voice carried from the other room, narrating something to herself about Gerald and the philosophical implications of shell-based architecture. Garrett crossed to where Nora stood and took her hand. "I love you," he said. Not as a question or a proposal or a milestone, just as the thing that's been true for a while and is now being said out loud. Nora's free hand came up to his face. "I love you too. I think I have since the second Saturday when you could have said no and didn't." They stood there in the kitchen of the apartment on the 3rd floor with Bryn in the next room, and the dishes done and the table cleared, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Because this was it. This was the permanence that mattered. Not the grand gestures or the perfect words, but the accumulation of ordinary days that had been chosen and rechosen until they became the only life either of them wanted. The painting hung in the living room now, the one with the open door and light on both sides. Garrett passed it every morning on his way to make coffee, and every time he passed it, he understood it a little better. It wasn't about going through the door or closing it behind you. It was about the moment of standing in the opening, when you could see both what you were leaving and what you were entering, and you chose to move forward anyway. Nora had painted that door as an invitation to herself, a promise that there was still light on the other side of grief if she was brave enough to walk through. And she had been. They both had. Saturday arrived as it always did, with Bryn awake too early, and Garrett making coffee in the quiet apartment, and Nora emerging from the bedroom with her hair still damp from the shower. They drove to Riverside Cafe the way they had driven there every Saturday for nearly 7 months, and Bryn narrated the entire journey with her particular brand of relentless observation. The cafe was crowded. Their corner table, the wobbly one, sat empty waiting. Bryn claimed it with the confidence of long-established territory, and Garrett and Nora followed, and within 5 minutes they had ordered their drinks and settled into the rhythm that had become as essential to their week as breathing. Garrett opened his notebook. He had started keeping it 5 years ago when Bryn was barely 2, and he was trying to hold on to the parts of her that would disappear if he didn't write them down. Now it was nearly full. Nearly time for a new one. He flipped to a blank page and wrote the date. Then he waited pen ready for Bryn to say something worth keeping. She was describing a situation involving a classmate named Theo, who had apparently not learned anything about diplomacy in 3 years, and Garrett was writing it down, and Nora was listening with the focused attention she gave to everything Bryn said. And in that moment, with the cafe noise around them, and the morning light coming through the window, and his daughter talking, and the woman he loved sitting across from him, Garrett understood that this was what he had been waiting for. Not the absence of difficulty, not the promise that nothing would ever hurt again, but the presence of people who chose to stay even when staying was hard. The door he had kept closed for 2 years had finally opened, and Nora had walked through it, and Bryn had been standing there the whole time waiting for him to notice that the door had never really been locked. It had just been heavy, and he had needed help pushing it open. The fourth chair sat at their table, occupied now by the canvas tote bag that Nora had brought with her, the same one she had carried on that first Saturday, though it no longer held an envelope addressed to whoever found it. Now it held sketchbooks and charcoal and the accumulated materials of a life being actively lived. Garrett reached across the table and took Nora's hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and Bryn looked up from her hot chocolate and smiled. Outside, the city continued its Saturday morning routine. Inside, 3 people sat at a table that wobbled slightly when anyone set down their cup, and nobody minded. Because wobbling just meant it had been used enough to matter. And that was all that permanence ever really was, the decision to keep showing up week after week until the showing up became the thing itself. Bryn finished her story about Theo. Garrett capped his pen. Nora squeezed his hand once and let go to reach for her coffee. And the morning light came through the window of Riverside Cafe and landed on their table, warming everything it touched.